morning, everyone. Welcome. See so many familiar faces. I'm glad you're here in the classroom, and also those of you who are maybe still lounging. I wasn't going to say in their beds, but probably on a couch somewhere, maybe, or lazy boy. We're here to listen to a very important topic as part of our Great Decisions series. And since you signed up for it, you know what it is. But let me just say that global famine is something that our speaker has said it's very, very sad, a very sad topic to deal with. And we can only imagine that this type of crisis is now even exacerbated in Israel and in the Gaza. And so we're going to hear more about that issue, which is part of our Great Decisions series. So my name is Kit Leggett, and I am a member of the Social Sciences Subcommittee here at Hope, and I have the pleasure of working with wonderful people like Dr. Stephen Smith here, our guest today. And would you check your cell phones right now? Make sure that they are turned off, and then they won't be a distraction. And thank you for that. And our special thanks today is the lady in the corner, Gloria Goodwin, who is supporting our hybrid modalities. So all the people at home can thank her especially. One way we've got here today that you can give back to HASP is to share your personal and professional experience as a presenter of a course. Do you have a great idea, but need some help building your course? Just a little push. Has uncertainty about your visual aid kept you from being in the front room? Well, here's a solution I have for you. Please join HASP members Dave and Susan Couch. They're going to be introducing Microsoft PowerPoint. Sounds scary. And they will provide you with tips and tricks for an engaging presentation. So you'll learn how to insert images and text, create title and context slides, and learn templates for easy slide design. So think about that, please. And if you are interested, please see either Amy or Ian after class today. And the class is called PowerPointers, Tips and Tricks for Your Next Presentation. You know what? I think you're still gonna have to see Ian or Amy because it doesn't tell me. Okay. Okay. I worked 23rd October. Is it the 9:30 slot? Okay. There you go. It's the big building right next to the Jack.
Kit, could you repeat that in the microphone, please?
About the class? Yes, the class is called PowerPointers, and it's for those of us who would really like to become engaged in presenting a course. There's something that we know that no one else knows, and it's enjoyable, and we would like to share it with the crowd here, but we don't know how to do it. So this course is going to be for you, and it's designed for you by David and Susan Couch, who know what they're talking about. October 23 at 9:30 in the Martha Miller building, room 237. Thank you. Does that help, Gloria? Good. Well, as I said, the course for today is Global Famine, and it's part of Great Decisions. And we have had fears of global famine since Russia invaded Ukraine last year. And that has disrupted grain shipments from major grain producers But what about countries that were suffering before this? Droughts, invasions of other kinds. And how do we define famine? And how is it different from simple food shortage? And what, if any, remedies are there that we can employ? Our speaker today, I'm honored to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Smith, and he is a professor of econ and the Ruck Fellow at Hope College. He's also just been granted the Robert W. Hack Endowed Chair in Econ at Hope College. So I'm very proud of that. He's a specialist in global economic development and international trade. He has written extensively on the relationship between Christian ethics and economics and currently serves as the president of the Association of Christian Economists. He earned his BA degree at Williams College, and he holds a PhD from Stanford. And we're asking that once Dr. Smith has started his presentation, that you would kindly hold your questions to the end, and that will help the flow of the presentation. And I'm really interested to hear our speaker today. Would you help me welcome Dr. Stephen Smith?
People, it's a terrific pleasure to be with you here today. I'm in my 8th year at Hope. This is my 4th presentation at HASP, and I'm always happy to do these. You folks engage so thoughtfully with the topics that we talk about, and I so enjoy thinking about your questions and your comments. So thank you for inviting me here today. Special thanks to Kit and to Ian for the invitation and for working with me to get ready for today. I might add, particularly for this topic, that if there happens to be anybody online or in this room who is a retired professional in the area of U.S. economic aid or famine relief or anything that might touch upon this topic, I would be particularly interested to hear, and I think all of us would be interested to hear your perspective on the issues we talk about and touch on this morning as well. So please don't hesitate to speak up, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. First, we will watch the video by the Foreign Policy Association, and then I'll offer about 25 minutes of comments and thoughts about famine that expand and complement, I think, what the video offers. There will be four short topics that I address: my personal modest experience with famine, something of an overview, second, of famines in the past century or so, including a look at 3 selected cases. Third, how economists think about famine, rightly or wrongly, you can decide, but there's a paradigm that now kind of governs how economists think about famine, and it's spoiler alert, it's basically this: lack of food is a presenting symptom of famine, but lack of food is almost never the actual cause of famine. It's something else, virtually always. So that's the kind of the state of the thinking in economics, and I'll unpack that a little bit for you. And then the fourth topic I'll address will be policy options for dealing with famine. There's some really interesting stuff there. We'll touch on it, and then we'll get as fast as we can into our Q&A. So let me hit the button here, and we will begin the video.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2023, an 8-lecture masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. We continue to work our way through this year's Great Decisions challenges. Our focus today turns to topic number 6, which is global famine. These are among the most difficult images in world politics to look at. People struggling for their daily survival, hard-pressed to find the nutrition, the food that they need for themselves and their families. In terms of the distribution of people suffering with food insecurity, the primary concentration is in Africa, where some 73 million people living in 36 countries face food shortages on a daily basis. If we look a little more closely at Africa, we'll see the primary focus is going to be on those areas just south of the Sahara Desert, over to the Horn of Africa, up into the Arabian Peninsula, and towards the center of the continent. What is it that causes famine and food insecurity? A primary driver historically has been armed conflict among nations or within them. Conflict disrupts food supply lines, destroys land that could be used for agricultural purposes, and obviously kills people who might be farmers. There's also the problem of poverty, where people simply do not have access to enough resources to buy the food that they need. Poor governance certainly would make the list. Far too often, non-democratic governments will prioritize their base of support over the population as a whole. There are also trade pattern issues that cause food insecurity. You'll recall from a previous lecture, we considered the US-led liberal international economic order after World War II, which is based on market principles, capitalism, and free trade. That was a system that reflected America's strengths. The next round of countries that benefited from the American system were our European allies, who we quickly rebuilt after World War II and joined the international trading system. In the 1970s, certain countries along the Pacific Rim, like Japan, a little later Taiwan, Hong Kong, among others, found a niche in the global trading system by mass producing things that were in demand in Western markets. It is much later that countries in Africa and the developing world found their way into the global trading network. Largely agrarian societies, they don't enjoy that comparative advantage in the mass production of commodities, industrial products, and the like that we find in the Pacific and in Europe. As a result, the people that live in those regions are largely poorer with less access to global commodities, including foodstuffs. Demographic growth plays a role in food insecurity. In some nations, like Nigeria, the population is skyrocketing. It's impossible for the government to keep up and for the market to provide all of those new people with access to food. Educational systems play a role. As nations are increasingly literate and skilled, they join the global trading network. They're rewarded through a capitalist system and able to purchase the food that they need. Those without a broad-based and quality education quickly fall behind. And finally, there is climate change. We'll look at climate migration in topic number 8 as we wrap up the series. But certainly climate change has rendered many agricultural products no longer viable. We've seen over the course of the last couple of years a significant increase in food insecurity. In fact, between 2020 and 2021, a 25% increase in food insecurity. At the time of the filming of this lecture, November of 2022, we don't have the most recent data, but experts anticipate the surge has continued well into the 2023 period. Even in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, there is food insecurity. You can see the pockets in the Deep South, as well as other portions of the country, where Americans struggle to find the nutrition that they need to sustain themselves and remain healthy. In our country, which produces more food than any other, we waste each year about 206 billion pounds of food. So management is a real challenge for the United States. In 2022, the world faced a global food crisis caused by many factors. There was the rising price of commodities in general. This year has been incredibly inflationary across the Western world, especially. The Russian invasion of Ukraine disrupted not one but two major exporters, Russia and Ukraine, of wheat and other foodstuffs. The lingering effects of the economic crisis related to COVID and the mass increase in prices caused by the first three factors. Roughly 50% increase in food prices in many markets, which simply places food beyond the reach of many struggling people. Even when countries, individually or the world, increases the amount of basic foodstuffs like rice, grain, and oilseeds, if demand is keeping up, consumption lines are surpassing, we're going to face food insecurity. Production of basic foodstuffs needs to increase by roughly twofold, 100% or double by the middle of the century to keep up with growing population and consumer demands. Before we consider U.S. foreign policy as it relates to food, we will consider first the implications of famine, institutions and aid policy, as well as the food supply chain. We begin with implications of famine. Grave human suffering is the most obvious implication. The image we saw earlier and many others shows us the human toll when people cannot gain access to sufficient nutrition and food. A diversion of human resources. Rather than creating highly productive and profitable items, a nation has to redirect its workforce to agricultural pursuits. Mass migration across international boundaries, oftentimes within countries as well, is caused by food insecurity. And finally, as counterintuitive as it may sound, obesity-related health concerns are linked to food insecurity. This happens when people don't have the resources to buy nutritious foods, fibers, and the like. So instead, they substitute that with very inexpensive, cheap, and non-nutritious food, eating lots of empty calories. As a result, they develop diabetes, blood pressure issues, a range of heart-related illnesses, and declines in quality of living. There are many global institutions that play a central role in addressing international food crises. There is the Food and Agriculture Organization and UN World Food Programs. One a specialized agency, the other a program of the United Nations. They are funded by the voluntary contributions of nation states. They provide food assistance along a wide spectrum of activities, as does the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which seeks to help poorer countries develop sustainable agricultural growth patterns. UNICEF, with its focus on children in emergency situations, addresses nutrition and famine, as does the World Health Organization. All of these agencies are funded by nation states. First among them is the United States. We provide more funding as well as more food aid than any country in the international system. Third, we have the global food supply chain that is problematic at times. From the point of production, through processing, aggregation and distribution to markets and consumers, any of a number of wrinkles in the fabric can disrupt the supply chain. Drought, flooding, climate change, all can affect production. We've seen in the last year or so a major labor shortage, which has reduced the ability of companies to process and distribute foodstuff. And then finally, inflation, which is affecting all of the supply chain, comes to bear in the market, where consumers are forced to pay an increasingly high amount for foodstuffs. Conflict at any of these food supply chain stages can cause disruptions or even a halt to the distribution of food to market. When war broke out in 2022, Ukraine was the obvious victim, but the impact of this war is felt far beyond the shores of the Black Sea, because both Ukraine and Russia are major producers of wheat and grain, basic cereal stuff that the world relies upon on a daily basis. You can see here that Russia ranks number 1 and Ukraine is number 5. Collectively, they're larger than both the United States and Canada combined. The countries most vulnerable, not surprisingly, are found in the developing world and on the continent of Africa. Somalia and Benin receive 100% of their wheat from Russia and or Ukraine. And that means they suddenly have to replace all of it with very little warning from sources outside of that region. The war in Ukraine has brought about a serious conversation about the possibility of a simultaneous collapse in the world's grain production and that commodity's availability. Normally, when we think about a collapse in grain production, it's rather limited. 1 or 2 regions of the world, either not producing enough food or because of conflict or climate, they cannot deliver the food that they need. And this is a problem that's most often addressed with market principles. When the profit margin goes up, there are new producers that enter the market, and there's also the aid that many countries provide directly to those that are suffering. The 2007 drought in Ukraine and Russia exemplifies a limited collapse, as does the post-2020 COVID pandemic. A simultaneous collapse occurs when multiple, if not the majority of regions that produce a commodity, such as rice, oilseed, wheat, or grain, are suffering and unable to produce as anticipated. This creates a long-term and sustained famine in many regions of the world. Our attention now turns to U.S. foreign policy as it relates to global famine. There are 3 basic foreign policy directions that we can take, from food aid, directly providing aid to countries, multilateral aid through institutions referenced earlier, and finally humanitarian intervention to physically deliver food aid where it is most needed. We begin with food aid. As noted earlier, the United States is the most generous country in the world when it comes to food aid. We provide enormous amounts of assistance to countries across the globe in wheat, grain, soy, among other foodstuffs. Last year, the United States donated some $182 billion worth of foodstuff to countries that were in need. Our nation produces far more food than we could ever eat. We are the breadbasket of the world. Our government pays farmers not to grow certain crops. It pays farmers not to sell the crops that it does grow, and then it later pays farmers to help distribute the food aid to necessary communities in the system. The 2021 numbers represent a 49% increase over the previous year, again making us the #1 food donor in the system. Here you can see areas where the U.S. Drug Administration has agricultural service and food assistance projects that are active. It spans the globe from east to west and north to south. One of the more controversial U.S. food aid policies is referred to by its critics as the Terminator gene. Scientists have learned to genetically modify food, to make stalks that are stronger and sturdier, crops that are drought resistant, and in need of fewer pesticides. We've also genetically modified our food so that the seeds cannot reproduce. We do this so that when we give seeds to countries around the world in the form of wheat and grain, they will not be able to plant it and become agricultural competitors with us in the future. We're supplying them with the food that they need today, but we're denying them the ability to grow their own crops in the future. Countries in Africa face a real dilemma in whether or not to accept American food aid, because they've been informed by the European Union that if they accept any food aid from the United States, the Europeans will assume they're feeding it to their livestock, and therefore the livestock are contaminated with genetically modified seeds. The European Union, therefore, bans the import of African beef from the European market. So the question for African leaders can become, do we allow our people to starve now for lack of food, or later for lack of export of beef products in a profitable market to Europe? Multilateral aid is the next avenue. This is taking food aid through an institution, in collection with other countries. As noted earlier, the United States is the top bilateral food donor in the world. We could also play an increased role in multilateral donations, which have a greater impact, at least in theory. So imagine that we have three countries on the left-hand side that are providing funding to countries on the right-hand side. This could be food aid itself, or it could be technical assistance to help those countries on the right side grow better crops moving forward. In between the two, we have an international institution, such as the International Food Organization. Money flows into that organization. It then distributes it in ways that it believes have the greatest impact on those three countries, both in the immediate and in the long term. And studies do show that multilateral aid through one institution has a greater long-term effect on nations than bilateral aid. The benefits: ongoing operations of a long-term nature. The countries receiving the assistance also have the expertise and experience offered by the institutions who have been working on these projects for long periods of time. Focused projects in agriculture, in soil treatments, crop rotations, and the like, and in some ways, most importantly, long-term planning. Because when Western governments change leadership every 4, 5, or 6 years, oftentimes food policy changes with it. The final option for dealing with famine across the globe is humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention is a military-supported operation that targets a country without its permission. It must have a limited aim of humanitarian relief. You cannot invade to save people from starving and then capture oil fields along the way. The aim must be limited to humanitarian relief, and it is only legal if the UN Security Council approves it. We have involved ourselves in humanitarian relief operations over time. Some of them have been highly successful. The intervention in Iraq from 1991 to 96 stands out as a successful test case. And on the other end of the spectrum, an abject failure would be Somalia in 1992 and 93. Cases in between, varying degrees of success and failure. Let's take a look at the two extreme cases, beginning with Iraq in 1991. The senior Bush administration looked at Iraq through very clear, calculating eyes. We understood in the aftermath of the long war with Iran, which ended in 1988, that Iraq was very close to the lower threshold of power to sustain itself. We never wanted Iraq to become too powerful, but we also did not want it to fall through the floor and disintegrate into chaos. Iraq's rise in its power level began almost immediately after the conclusion of that Iran-Iraq war. When it invaded Kuwait in 1990, the United States recognized it must address this rising power level inside the country. We did so through Operation Desert Storm, attacking Iraq and reducing its military capability to the point that Iraqis began to revolt against their own government. We were actually concerned that Iraq might fall down through the lower level and turn into chaos in the 1990s. We intervened in Iraq not to topple the government in 1991, but rather to support the people who were suffering under Saddam's rule. This was a humanitarian intervention that followed the military operation of Desert Storm. You can see on the graph on the left-hand side, we designated northern and southern no-fly zones. Anything above the 36th or below the 33rd, we did not allow Saddam's military to enter. We did so in order to support the people living in those regions. It was called Operation Provide Comfort. The United Kingdom led the effort, but the United States was there with it. NATO supported the no-fly zone intact, shielding the Kurds in the north, Shia in the south, and providing them with humanitarian aid, including food. Food blankets, medicine, other necessities were provided by the Western allies to keep the Kurds alive in the mountains in the winter and prevent them from disappearing. In the aftermath of that intervention, Iraq did regain its footing, grow in power, to the point that the younger Bush administration decided in 2003 that it needed to be knocked down a level once again. The Somali operation was not a success by any measure. The food insecurity in that country in 1990, 91, and into 1992 was severe. When the Cold War ended, the superpowers lost interest in countries like Somalia and Ethiopia. We had provided them with massive amounts of military assistance during the Cold War, and so when they failed as nation states in the aftermath, those weapons were readily available. An additional weapon used by regional forces was food. Regions were deprived because they did not support this leader as opposed to another one. During the 1992 presidential debate, three people took to the stage: Mr. Bush, the incumbent on the left, Ross Perot, the independent, and Bill Clinton on the right-hand side. And Mr. Clinton, who of course was not in power, found it very easy to criticize the senior Bush administration for not doing more in places like Bosnia, Cambodia, and Somalia. The American public began to demand a response after the election of 1992. The senior Bush administration was in lame duck status. The Clinton administration would be inaugurated in January the following year. So Colin Powell, a chief policy and military advisor to President Bush, established three conditions for the U.S. entry into Somalia. Number one, limited geographically to the port city of Mogadishu, a large population center where most of the food was being bottlenecked by armed gangs. Number two, limited in policy scope, only food delivery. We're not there to fix the country. We're not there to solve its problems. We're not choosing sides. We're only going to deliver food aid. And number three, the operation must be completed and out of country before inauguration, only a handful of weeks later. They did not want to leave a complicated situation like Somalia in the hands of a newcomer to the White House in the form of Bill Clinton. Operation Restore Hope included 25,000 U.S. troops, and it was a smashing success. People began to rebound very quickly. The food was distributed. The armed gangs backed away. In fact, the operation was too successful because the United Nations pleaded with Washington to please stick around a little longer, ensure the smooth delivery of aid until the other countries on the Security Council could figure out what to do about it. President Clinton, fresh in office, decided not only to stay in Somalia, but to dramatically expand the operation. We transitioned from merely feeding the starving, which is quite doable, to fixing Somalia politically, socially, and economically. And in so doing, we were clearly taking sides, one against the other. We got caught in the crosshairs. On that solemn day in the fall of 1993, when American helicopters went down in Mogadishu, 18 American service members died in the crosshair, being targeted by various Somali factions. The U.S. left Somalia almost immediately, and a starving population had very few places to turn. So humanitarian intervention, it can be highly positive and successful, Iraq in the early 1990s, or an utter disaster, which is what happened earlier in Somalia in 1993. I thank you for joining me in this Great Decisions Challenge. Next week, our subject is Iran at the crossroads. Please stay engaged and make great decisions.
So we're going to shift gears here, and you'll notice that I think my comments are aimed to complement what we just heard and saw here. But if we have time, I would pick a few bones with what was said here, and that might be fun to think about. I bet you all have some thoughts as well. So I'll make sure to leave enough time for us to have a good conversation about all of this. So the first part of my comments have to do with what I would call my modest experience with famine, and why this feels personal to me. I was an infant when my parents arrived in Hong Kong in early 1958. They were missionaries. They were sent there to work with the Chinese Baptist churches in Hong Kong, which were well established in that period. But the great Chinese famine was building in this period, and Hong Kong, British colony then, had only 2 million people, was soon overwhelmed with hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing that terrible famine in mainland China. My parents and the whole expat missionary community, and NGOs on the scene in Hong Kong, everybody pivoted towards providing food and shelter for the refugees. So some of my very earliest memories are of seeing people in rags, living in hillside shacks and roadside crates. But people thrilled to be in Hong Kong, considering themselves the lucky ones compared to the extraordinary amount of death that was occurring in China. Oh, there's the, there we go. Here we go. Here's a picture my father took in 1958. This is a children's feeding center in Hong Kong. And I'm not sure what the kids on the left-hand side are looking up at there. Something interesting must have been happening, but here you get a sense of the poverty of the era, and this is in Hong Kong, where people were able to get food. Here are some of the roadside shacks in which people lived. You can see laundry hanging on the left, and houses made up out of literally out of pieces of cardboard and tin. I have vivid memories of the housing estates that the Hong Kong government built in part to house people in this refugee influx. The rooms in these estates, these massive cement buildings, the rooms were basically 7 feet by 12 feet to accommodate whole families. I'm guessing some of you have seen these estates in Hong Kong if you have visited Hong Kong in recent decades. But they were enormously helpful in dealing with the refugee influx, which was the classic kind of thing that happens in a famine situation as people flee. When, as a teenager in Hong Kong, I reflected on these and other experiences in Asia, where I could see there were places buoyant with economic growth, like Hong Kong, and other places that were stagnating, clearly, like Maoist China in that era. It was those kinds of considerations that nudged me and got me interested in studying economics. So here I am. So let's take a quick look at famines in recent history to give you a sense of the magnitude and the location of those events. I don't know about you, but when I need data about global issues, I often go to the World Bank and the incredible World Development Indicators that are now available with data on all kinds of countries. But the other place I go is the website www.Our World in Data, first started by Hans Rossler, and now, after his recent passing, now continued by his research team and actually some of his children, who are in their own rights marvelous statisticians. What we have here is basically decade by decade, a bar graph showing the number of people who died in famines globally in these decades. And you can see here, the 1870s were particularly bad. We had basically 20.4 million people, and these are fuzzy estimates. There's behind them like ranges of people's views about what's how many people died. But clearly the 1870s was a tough decade. And then here, straddling the 1950s and the 1960s, you can see the evidence of the great China famine, which I'll talk about more in a minute. For those of you on this side, I'm referring to this big number in the 1870s, and then these two columns from the 1950s and 1960s, showing the effects of the Great China Famine, which occurred across both of those decades, at the end of the 1950s and the early 1960s. What I would a takeaway I'd offer here is that the past 5 decades have been remarkably good compared to the historical record. It's clear that something different is happening now, and that's a remarkable reduction in famine deaths globally, which I'll speak to in just a minute. Perhaps a slightly more useful take on this data is to shift ground here, and instead of looking at the total number of deaths, let's consider famine deaths as a share of the world population in each of these decades. So the way these numbers work here, here's the 1870s again, and the number now is 142.2, meaning that per 100,000 people in the world, in the decade of the 1870s, there were 142 famine deaths per 100,000 people. So things are scaled. And the story here is basically even better. You can see that the reduction now the famine deaths as a share of the world population is much smaller than before, and that the decline has actually been kind of steady, in the past 100 years or so. It's fair to ask what causes this. What's been driving this basically, I would say, this basically reasonably good news here, that the rate of famine deaths has fallen so considerably. And I'd say there's a number of things going on. If we look just in the last 50 years, from the 70s through now, the improvement in agricultural techniques and agricultural inputs has just been astonishing. Actually, it goes back a little bit before the 1970s. Norman Borlaug's work with the Green Revolution, the high-yielding seed varieties, really have transformed agriculture in much of the developing world. They really have. They've, in India, they've led to a tripling of wheat yields. Apart from all the other things that India has done to improve yields, just the HYVs, the high-yielding varieties alone have radically increased grain output. Higher incomes around the world have also considerably helped ease the stress of famines. People with higher incomes can afford to buy more food. I mean, it is as basic as that. And better transportation connections now allow much greater trade in food and much easier movement of food. And this helps farmers get food to market. This also helps buyers in famine areas pay to bring food in. So a more transportationally connected world is a better thing for fighting famine. So is better global communication, which has been a huge factor. People now have much better knowledge of famine, and that ability to communicate better and know where famine exists it encourages and enhances famine responses. Finally, our video went over this very fast, but the institutions globally for delivering aid to famine-affected areas are much more robust now and much better articulated. And so the World Food Program, for instance, is now much more capable of delivering food rapidly to particular places, much of it American food, than was the case in earlier eras. Now, in a second, we'll look at some particular famines, but I should mention before I go much further that our video alluded to this, but there is an interesting question about exactly how to measure famine. The reality is, for much of human history, large portions of any society's population lived with what we might call today chronic malnutrition, a chronic hunger, leading to low birth rates, low birth weights, not low birth rates, low birth weights for children, and a kind of level of exhaustion that would be unfamiliar to us today. Even in Britain, from the period from 1500 through 1800, those 300 years were right prior to the Industrial Revolution. Britain suffered from a chronic malnutrition. Most of its population was chronically malnourished. But that doesn't qualify as famine. What makes a famine is some specific, let me get this for you exactly right, some specific benchmarks. And so the typical definition that's used now internationally is this. A famine is declared when at least 20% of households in a given area face extreme food shortages. More than 30% of children suffer from acute malnutrition. And there are at least 2 deaths per 10,000 people occurring each day as a result of hunger or a combination of hunger and illness. Now, that's a hard definition and a strange definition to remember, but you can see all the factors that are in play. The data we've just been looking at meets this criteria for constituting famine deaths. And this is now the awkward but not unreasonable definition that global aid institutions use and have used now for a while. So let's take a peek at the great China famine. The consensus here was that the excess mortality, that is, the number of people who died because of the famine, over and above the number of people who, in the normal course of events, absent the famine, might have died. The excess mortality here was, the consensus estimate is between 24 and 35 million people. Interestingly, this is widely considered to be the largest famine death toll in history, as best as people can tell. And its causes are interesting and actually quite relevant for thinking about the way famines evolve and the kinds of things that are necessary in order to head them off. I would characterize the Great Chinese Famine as being the result of a perfect storm of communist central planning mistakes and a totalitarian government. And there were some floods. China historically has often had floods along its great major rivers, and And in 1957 and 58, there were some unusually big floods, but I think you'll see that flooding really wasn't the issue. The perfect storm basically looked like this. The Chinese government had literally just in the years prior completed the collectivization of of agriculture. Farmers were moved out of villages and into basically factory farming situations where they lived in dorms. They ate in collective canteens, and they were marched out to the fields to work every day and back at night. In this situation, farmers had no direct right to food. The government took the harvested food and used it in various ways, supporting workers at valuable state-owned or perceived valuable state-owned enterprises in the rest of China, supporting health and access to food in urban areas, which, by the way, farmers weren't allowed to migrate to because of China's internal apartheid system, the Hoku system, which still exists. I would add that there were collective delusions in agriculture. A view got established that if you plowed deeper and you planted seeds closer together, you'd get better yields. And this defied centuries of traditional Chinese understanding of how best to grow rice, never mind wheat. It was a disaster. In industry, the delusion was that a great leap forward was possible. In fact, this is what it was called, a great leap forward. I'm sure many in this room remember this. And the basic idea here was that heavy industrial production, the making of steel, the making of automobiles, could be outsourced to unskilled workers working in their backyards with very little capital. And this would work out. You could do this. And it was a complete disaster. But of course, political issues were perhaps even more important. There was crippling political fear within the system of offending party cadres, and so very little ability of the system to generate accurate information and move it up the chain of command. No independent news reporting, and an ideological rigidity that rejected out of hand the notion that China could buy food from the rest of the world in an emergency. Just a principial objection to trade and a commitment to self-sufficiency. This really was a perfect storm. Interestingly, subsequent research on this particular famine, subsequent research showed that China actually was in fact growing enough to feed everybody in the nation through this whole period, had it been distributed better. There was a substantial decline, a 30% decline in food output, but in terms of calories produced, the nation could have avoided the famine. So just a tragedy from top to bottom. Moving a little more close to the contemporary era, in Tigray province in Ethiopia, in 83, 85, we have here kind of a typical example of a famine in the modern era. The illustrations I'm going to use in a minute come from this World Vision website. The estimates are that between 400,000 and 1 million people died in this, and it was kind of a two-stage issue. First, there was a civil conflict between the Tigray region and the central government of Ethiopia, a group known as the Derg. It sounds vaguely ominous to me, but I'm not sure what it means in Ethiopian. Anyway, because of the conflict, the Derg prevented food markets from operating, and they brutally relocated families and routed relief to certain areas only. So in the middle of this, when a drought recurred and harvests failed, food scarcity became a famine, and the Derg actively kept aid from reaching people. Here's a picture from World Vision of a feeding camp in 1985 at where they were fighting the famine. It's certainly a bleak prospect there. For the record, World Vision stuck around, and this is one of the reasons it's such a well-regarded relief agency. They invested in Tigray province after the famine, and this is the site of another feeding center, not the one we just saw, I think, where by 30 years on in 2015, farmers were very fruitfully farming, and people were prospering. This, if you want to be encouraged about what actually can happen, long-term investments in development in the poorest regions can really pay off. Oh my goodness, this woman was 10 years old at the time of the famine in 1984. She was 10, and here she is playing with her youngest daughter. The mother and her younger brother were recovered from famine at a World Vision feeding center. Third example is taken right from today. The Sudan famine is may be underway again in the Darfur region. This is hard for Westerners to keep track of, but there's been more than 25 years of fighting, and it broke out again in April. The country's military, the official army of Sudan, is fighting a paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces, commanded by Lieutenant General Dagalo. And in the presence of this fighting in the region, payment systems have completely broken down. So the food imports exist. The Wall Street Journal reports that they are held in freighters in harbors in on the I guess it's the Gulf of I guess it's the Red Sea, waiting to be transported into Sudan, but for lack of payment. And looters are now targeting the World Food Program warehouses. So more than 4 million people have been displaced. 1.2 million of these are in other countries. And so basically famine is really looming here now, and may become really quite tragic soon. Now, I think everything we've seen here ties together to what I want to talk about next. And oh, by the way, here's a picture of a particularly difficult aspect of Eastern Darfur and Eastern Sudan is that water has to be trucked in, and that's, you can imagine. Everything we've seen here ties into the current view that economists have about famine. The fundamental causes are thought these days to be rooted in what Amartya Sen in his path-breaking work showed for which he won a Nobel Prize. His work showing that countries almost never lack food enough for everybody. Might not be in the region that's afflicted by malnutrition or famine, but the food exists and is typically in the country already, grown in other regions or stockpiled in other regions. Here's Professor Sen in 2017. Sen's basic idea is that famine occurs when people have no standing to demand food from the government, or to buy it, or to own the food that they themselves grow, or are blocked by armed conflict from obtaining it. In all of these cases, he introduced the phrase that people are not entitled to food, and that's the cause of famine, not lack of food per se. And he had something very scathing to say about the Chinese famine, excuse me. He rooted it in the fact that the government faced absolutely no pressure from newspapers or an opposition, or democratic norms just didn't touch the government in any way, and allowed the famine to roll for an extraordinary long time. The way I think of Sen's view is that it takes a double failure for there to be a famine, that there needs to be some kind of interruption of food production combined with a failure of government or society's ability and willingness to protect people's access to food. The video touched on it. I can't emphasize it enough. It's hard sometimes for Americans to appreciate this, but the profoundly deep impact of bad governance and state failure in the world's poorest countries is almost impossible to overstate. And when I say failed states, I don't mean a state that struggles to deliver the mail. I mean a state like Democratic Republic of the Congo that controls major roads in the country and nothing else, where warlords roam in vast swaths of the country, and where, by the way, the U.S. is hoping to source a lot of its lithium for electric vehicles, just as a sidebar. I'd point out that although Sen is himself not a Christian, he's an atheist, but typically Christian food aid organizations and secular agencies as well take it as axiomatic that people in famine are in fact entitled to food. We could talk about some long-term consequences of famine. Happy to answer questions about that, but let me end with some straightforward policy issues for dealing with famine. It's important that there be early warning. Typically, if the famine's begun and you're beginning to mobilize resources, it's too late to do as much as you could have done had you started earlier. And to the great credit of the United States, USAID has been instrumental in developing early warning systems. Food aid really is essential. If the famine's underway and a humanitarian disaster is occurring, rapid delivery of food is in fact wise. It will in fact save lives. So this is particularly appropriate, I think, in cases of severe natural disasters or in war. But in other situations, if you can bring aid into a situation where the famine hasn't set in yet, cash is actually now economists' favorite policy approach. Bringing cash to a region allows potential famine victims to buy food, to pay for its import, and it empowers local farmers to make investments in their local agricultural systems rather than dumping free food, which pushes agricultural prices down quite low and harming the future of farming in a region like that. The U.S. indeed remains an indispensable player. I think the numbers about U.S. food aid were a little exaggerated in the video. We can talk about that. The numbers I'm looking at show the U.S. In recent years giving around $3 billion worth of food aid annually. But you can see that there. That's the numbers here are in millions, and so that's excuse me, $3 billion. That's $3 billion worth of food aid. We are the most indispensable player in famine prevention and famine remediation right now. And with that, I hope I've said enough controversial things or provocative things, and I would enjoy getting into the Q&A. Thank you for your patience.
I have a question back here about the great Ukrainian famine, which was about 25 years before the Chinese famine. If you could address that.
Absolutely. The Holodomor. A tragic event, very strikingly similar to the Great Chinese Famine in that, but in some ways even worse. You had Stalin ideologically committed to removing, quote unquote, the capitalist oriented skilled farmers, the ones who were the prosperous farmers in Ukraine, the kulaks, the so-called kulaks. You had a system like China's where the word of the supreme leader was death to contravene, and so the famine proceeded. That the killings wiped out a lot of entrepreneurship, and I'm honestly not sure what natural conditions were in that period, but it was sad to see even Western reporting get caught up in the misinformation that was being presented by Moscow about what was happening in Ukraine. People in the West, with their own ideological commitments, either were trying to raise the issue of the famine and the violence, or poo-poo it and minimize it, and just a tragic episode. Is there anything in particular you'd like me to speak about in terms of Ukraine?
Here's a question. In your mention of the use of cash donations to countries early in evidence of famine building makes sense. What I worry, have we seen, the thing that would worry me is that bad governance enters in so many times, and corruption. And so the possibility of cash being diverted would seem like a real threat. Have we been able to do that without such, interference?
In a word, no. I should, so a little more context here. At this point, my understanding is that still U.S. aid into famine or pre-famine situations is still only about 5% cash, and 95% hard food, wheat, rice, that sort of thing, lentils. The problem you point to is manifestly important, and it's not 100% clear to me how that could work. Or how it would work best. There are some actors in these situations that have good reputations for financial probity. A number of the Christian relief organizations, Catholic and Protestant, have really good reputations for handling funds well. Now, what's the best way to do that? I think that's still very much under exploration. But where it has happened, it appears to work really remarkably well. Poor people capable of buying food attract food supplies, and if markets aren't being specifically disrupted by specific military action, markets will emerge, and people will be able to buy food. We'll see how this goes.
We have a question online. Can you explain the link explain from the video the link between genetically altered grain to Africa and the EU ban on beef from those grain-fed cows?
Yes, sure. I happy to do that. Yeah, the background here is that the Europe for more than 20 years has banned beef imports where the cattle have been fed genetically modified food. And that's been actually a real bone of contention in trade policy between the US and the EU. The US would be, if it wasn't for the genetic feed that most US beef is raised with, Europe would be a big market for US beef. What has begun to happen is that as African farmers raise cattle with genetically modified grains, they too have met with an import ban from the EU. It's not clear how that gets resolved. But if I may say, although that is actually a live trade issue and it deserves attention and resolution, I would not have, if personally, if it was me, I wouldn't have highlighted that as a central trade issue for poor, impoverished African countries. Those countries have very young labor forces. That something in a number of sub-Saharan African countries, 40% of their population is under 14 years old. I mean, if you can imagine such a thing. What's needed is work in the production of particular goods that uses relatively unskilled labor, that absorbs a lot of unskilled labor. And that happens in agriculture, and that happens in low-tech manufacturing. And if I was to say what the single biggest barrier is to African growth in terms of global challenges, I would say it's that China is continuing to try to hold on to low-tech industries for its population when China really is now way more advanced than that, and needs, I would say, for the sake of the world, needs to give up making textiles and apparel and sneakers. And some of that's happening already by regular market forces, but it's not happening as fast as it should be happening. And it should be Africa that becomes the low-tech manufacturing capital of the world. Now, I'm speaking in really big terms here, but and I'm going a little bit away from the specific question, but I think that's where Africa's real future lies in agricultural exports, not beef, and in low-tech manufactured goods. Yes.
I have lots of thoughts. But first of all, I wanted to say I appreciate the complexity of the situation, both in your presentation and what was presented in the talk, because it is so complex. It didn't address very specifically the policy changes that also need to happen instead of just providing aid. Are there policy issues? And I think you started to speak to that when you're looking at the genetically produced versus, the trade things. So I'm wondering about changes in policies. I'm thinking like organizations for Bread for the World, that really the focus is, yes, we need to continue support and aid, but what policies can enhance communities, countries to grow their own food. I'm thinking of subsistence farmers where that is no longer the option, to have seeds that they can plant and then grow, harvest, and plant their seeds again because of the amount of genetically produced issues. Right. There's so many intertwining complexities in this. I guess I'm just wondering about, and I want to thank you for your presentation, but also, speak to some of the complexities, I guess.
Well, happy to do that. And this is some of the bread and butter of the course I teach here at the college on economic development. Almost by definition, the countries that are most vulnerable to famine are the countries who are the poorest in the world, which is why, with basically just one exception in the last 50 years, all the world's famines have been in sub-Saharan Africa. These are deeply poor countries where governments are astonishingly dysfunctional. If they had functional governments, they'd be using the copious amounts of international financial aid that flow to their countries to properly build out transportation networks and communications networks and primary school education and agricultural extension services. And you see very little of that. You see governments using money for military purposes. You see these ongoing interminable wars in the region across that whole belt of sort of northern the northern sub-Saharan Africa set of countries. And in the face of that, aid organizations have gone to ground in a good way. They've really tried to focus on doing things at a village level, providing education, since the government's not. They're working in rural areas where the government has essentially, in most of these countries, simply abandoned any pretense of a presence and provision of public goods. They have aid organizations have built up medical networks. They have built clinics and hospitals. They have built schools, and they're in it, and they're in it for the long term. They're also very vested in community development in other ways. And so on the ground, there is some progress in many countries. Vaccination rates are rising. Deaths from diseases are falling. Deaths from childhood diseases are falling. But what's lacking ultimately is that governments aren't providing the things that only governments can provide. Rule of law, protection of property rights, and until you have rule of law and protection of property rights, people are going to stay as subsistence farmers because it's too risky to invest. Provision of finance, provision of credit to small farmers. Now, Uganda has done very well at that, and it actually is kind of an example, a counter example to everything I've just been saying. They've kind of leaned into developing agriculture, and the diversity now of their agricultural exports is tremendous. That agricultural sector is employing a lot of unskilled labor, and that's all to the good. Flourishing market towns are emerging, and that's going to help them long term. But for the poorest countries to the north, that whole band of the first row of sub-Saharan countries, deeply conflicted as they are between Islamists and non-Arab residents, until governments can take their minds off of fighting and back to doing things that only governments can do, we're in for a tough ride. That's only a partial answer. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yes, and then yes. Oh yeah, yes. Sorry.
Following this question and your answer about this, of course, we all know that teaching somebody to raise their own food is better than just feeding them. but still, I wanted to ask you, how much does because I got the idea that some places or some people still find that food aid is a big business
Yes. Yes.
for the giving country.
Yes.
So how much does that play in the fact that aid organizations have to fight a lot to get this other type of aid into these countries? Besides the problem that you mentioned about
Right.
the government in those countries also.
A very fair question. It's widely understood by aid professionals and economists that the requirement that the U.S. imposes that U.S. aid be delivered by the U.S. Transport that's an enormous waste of money. It just is. It just is. So many cheaper ways of bringing food to nations that need it. We give a lot of food. It's food that we've already subsidized in our agricultural sector. And it's, I think, greatly to our credit that we are willing to give it away, but we insist that it be carried on U.S. Transported on U.S. carriers, and we're indiscriminate in where we give it. We give it to countries where they actually aren't at risk of famine, and that depresses agricultural prices and makes agricultural development in those countries more difficult than it should be. So there's big issues there, and politically, that hasn't changed in 60 years. Yeah. Sorry.
The little proverb, give me a fish and eat for a day, teach me to fish and eat for a lifetime, comes to mind.
Yeah.
When I saw the thing about the sterile grains, sterile seeds,
Yes.
why are we not giving seeds that people can use to grow their own food? I mean, it's kind of perhaps related to your question. Is it a power thing that we want and a money thing that the providers want to be able to give the food and not allow the individuals to grow their own food?
I hate to say this, but we are at the edge of my knowledge on that particular point. I am not sure what the proportion is of in terms of the seeds that the U.S. donates. I don't know what the proportion is that are what's the technical word for it, that are don't generate fruitful seeds themselves, are one-shot use seeds for wheat and corn and the like, as opposed to perpetual. I do not. I'm afraid I don't know. Yes.
I think this is a related question in imports. So what is the EU's fear of genetically modified grains, and is it a health issue to them?
So the EU does justify its concern on the basis of health worries. There's been now more than 2 decades of experience with the U.S. eating beef that's fed on genetically modified grains. Are we the worst for that? Is this the unrecognized cause of polarization in the United States? I don't know, but I'm inclined to think that it has not been a problem. And all I can think is that at some point, Europe needs to the EU needs to give this up and import beef. By not importing from the U.S. and from Africa and other countries, they are paying way more for beef than they really need to. The beef is made at home, and Europe is an expensive place to graze cattle and raise beef. So they're really paying. And you would think at some point it has to change. Yes, thanks for your patience.
You read more and more about China giving Africa a lot of attention
Yes.
and with infrastructure and things like that. When are we going to learn to beat them with something like feeding them or letting them feed themselves?
That's a wonderful question. And China's influence in Africa is hotly contested. And in African countries, it's hotly debated. Economists are studying this, and the height of Chinese investment and aid to sub-Saharan Africa appears to have passed. It seems, looking back now, it seems to have really peaked in the mid 2010s. And one of the things that's happening, of course, is that China itself is feeling less generous, and it's preoccupied with domestic issues right now, and needs to be. But the other piece of it is that Africans themselves in many countries are less enamored of Chinese aid than they were 20 years ago or 15 years ago. There's been a lot of concern about the quality of the infrastructure projects that China has built. And I think they have not held up well compared to infrastructure projects that the World Bank has financed. After a while, that kind of sinks in. Now, the reality is part of the difficulty that the US and the EU have in providing assistance to Africa is that we insist on transparency. We ask for particular conditions, such as eliminating corruption in particular agencies. We ask that agencies bring themselves up to global standards, and even provide some of the professionals on site to help with those tasks. But a number of nations have found that onerous and have found it kind of imperialistic and considered it patronizing. And China never asked questions. China was kind of like, how much do you want? And what do you want us to build for you? And I don't see the US ever giving up that approach, or the EU. So I don't know exactly what happens next. But I think Africa is coming off of the dragon's high of the last few decades. Yes, please.
I may not be able to articulate this as well as I like because I have so many things swimming in my head, but the idea of seeds is something that I see incredibly important.
Yes.
Not only do we here in the United States allow a chemical company to determine whether we get to use our seeds more than once, and they have a patent on life, which to me just seems unconscionable. We have limited our supplies of grains to very few varieties. On this planet, there are thousands of varieties of different food crops. Our products are not being accepted in, say, Mexico, where you have numerous varieties of potatoes and other crops, because our products contaminate and no longer make these varietals possible, available, because they are now being affected by the genetic material of our seeds. And it goes on and on and on. And we cannot expect that other countries will be happy to accept our deviations and our limited varieties as a global standard. We just can't accept that or expect that. And like I said, it's all flowing around, but seeds and economics and giving something cannot be bedfellows.
So, several thoughts. I appreciate that you're kind of, thinking aloud about some things. You might be encouraged to know that since patents expire after 17 years, and the typical agricultural patent doesn't kick in until after testing, and so it doesn't last for the full 17 years on the market. There's a potential for all of those crops to go off patent, and it's same with pharmaceuticals, go off patent in a relatively short period of time, and then be usable for the whole rest of the world if they wish. Now, is this, long term, is this the best path for agriculture? And would we be better served if we had high yielding varieties of perennials rather than the seeds we use now? That's I don't, we might be. I don't know. I don't know. I will tell you that there's a really remarkable organization called the it's a research group that's paid for by donations to the United Nations. It does pro bono seed design and seed experimentation. And its Spanish acronym is CGIAR, and I never know what it is. I never know how to pronounce it. But it makes all of its innovations, its crop innovations, available free for any country. It's a global public good, and we could, our nation could sponsor more of that kind of research, just from Jump Street, researching new crops, new approaches to old crops, and then making that technology widely available for free. We do a little bit of that now through CGIAR, but more could be done. So just some quick thoughts on that.
We've come to the end of the question and answer period, and we want to thank Stephen Smith for being here with us and edifying us in ways that we needed, and hope that you can come back again sometime. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks.